What is the most depressing thing someone told you? Dealt with this in a few ways. If I can give one tip, frozen food. When my brother died, my parents were a wreck, as one might expect. Our extended family was in town for weeks. Funeral planning, memorial, all the things. There comes a time though when the funeral's done. All the family has to go back home. Kids have to get back to school. You all have to pretend things are normal again just to get through. To me, that was the hardest part. During that time, we must have had 2 months worth of frozen casseroles / lasagna / etc. that friends had made us. Beyond the obvious and simple burden it lifted off my parents, it also meant that each of those friends was at the table with us in spirit. It meant the world to me. I can still name every person that cooked for us and what they made 17 years later. Offer help, but some people want to be left alone, different for everyone obviously. Recently I lost someone and all I wanted was people to leave me alone and stop trying to grieve with me. I really didn't feel like having the same kinds of conversations over and over. Some people brought food, I appreciated that, but I had so much, most of it went bad. It starts feeling like everyone's trying to help you, but really you're being spread even thinner trying to help them with the grief. My friend's dad passed away last year and I just sent him $200 DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever it was. We were around every day, but we didn't talk about his dad. I think that's the way he wanted it. I hired an intern. As time went on, I learned more about him. At one point, he asked me how to shave. He had these bumps on his face and wanted to know why I did not. It turned out that he was shaving with hair clippers, no razor, shaving cream, aftershave, etc. Keep in mind, this is a 21 years old almost out of college. I learned he never had a father in his life and his closest male relative was a couple of states away. That really hit me hard. I took him to Target, bought the necessary supplies, and explained the process to him. We had many more conversations like this. He graduated and I set him up with a great job. We still keep in touch today. When I was working as a supervisor for security work, I had a kid working there who was about 20 years old. He would call out sick randomly and then when he'd come back he'd always look super haggard. I finally asked him if there was anything that I could do to help him, and he asked how he could prevent infections in his privates. Basically he was getting infections, going to a free clinic which asked no questions, gave him antibiotics and he'd get better a few days later, repeat. After a personal conversation, I found out he didn't know how to properly wash himself, and since he was an intact guy, he was having those issues. His father disappeared when he was a baby, his mother didn't tell him anything about keeping himself clean in that area and he'd been having these issues for most of his life. Fuck dude. I lost my brother to suicide in May. It's a hole that I don't know will ever be filled. There is always something missing. My last conversation was via text, and it haunts me. He was saying he wanted to come visit, I moved out of state, and we were both looking forward to it. I don't know I'll ever get the sound of my dad, broken down in tears, calling me to say he had found him out of my head. I got to visit his final resting place, him and his service dog, in August. I was hoping it would bring some closure. It didn't. Anyway, sorry about your loss. It's a pain that a lot of people just don't understand. I truly wish no one had to deal with a suicide. It hurts so much more than a death you can see coming. In high school, one of my teacher's wife ended up getting a tumor on her body. I remember he was very worried and scared. He didn't show it but you could tell. He told all 8 classes he had, lots of students. A couple weeks go by and his wife has a test for the tumor and it turned out to fortunately be benign. I asked him how his wife was and he broke the good news to me. He then proceeded to tell me, you know, of all the students and teachers I've told about my wife, you're the only one who asked me about her. My chest became tight and I felt horrible. Poor man was worried sick about the love of his life and no one cared. I was bagging groceries in high school. It was Christmas Eve and folks were bustling in and out getting last-minute items for their get-togethers. I bagged the groceries for this one lady who had just regular food instead of holiday food. I placed her groceries into the cart and followed her to her car. After loading her groceries, I told her to have a Merry Christmas. She responded that it was hard to have a Merry Christmas when her husband just died. Like the day before Christmas Eve he died. She broke down crying, flooding me with how heartbroken and alone she was. I was 16. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there and listened as she unloaded. Always thought about her near the holidays and it makes me thankful for my family. Actually, a few days ago my dad and stepmom called me out to have a family meeting, and in that meeting she said, your mom died almost a year ago, it's time to move. You act like you're the only one who lost a mom. I lost my mom 11 years ago and so many other kids lost their mom, and she also said, I hate how almost every conversation has your mom in it. Move on, she's dead. I was close to my mom and due to COVID I couldn't see her when she was in the hospital, and it's hard for me to get over that. My stepmom thinks because it's been a year since my mom died I should be over the grieving process. I'm not. I lost my dad 7 years ago when I was 20. There isn't a day that goes by I don't think about him, and I still cry over it frequently. Your stepmother is a callous, heartless woman. I'm sorry she said that to you. She had no right. Please take moments out of your day to check in with yourself. Try to do things in your mother's memory a few times a year. I take my young siblings to go feed ducks like my dad did with me, things like that. Your grief won't go away magically one day. The fact that hers did says to me she and her mother either didn't have a good relationship or she lacks the ability to empathize. My father's a very reserved kind of person, introvert, and highly unsocial. He has no friends around him. But he's very helpful, sympathetic, a good listener. Anyhow, one day he got a call from his work colleague from a different city. It was a war-torn area where he lived. He had just saw his whole family blown into smithereens from a drone strike. His wife, his daughters, and his mother were all in the house while he had just stepped out to run some errands. Needless to say, he was hysterical. He had already lost his father and brothers from previous rocket attacks and drone strikes, and he was inconsolable. He had no one left. Literally no one. My father was his supervisor's head and was the first person to receive his call way early in the morning. I got a random call from a doctor on Facebook in Indiana, I was in South Carolina, to tell me my dad was dying from multiple forms of cancer, and because I was next of kin I had to make the choice to pull the plug. This is after years of not hearing from him or knowing how bad off he was because of his new girlfriend. I drove 19 straight hours to get there to see him. They called me when I was less than 30 minutes away to say he was gone. And I found out the only reason the new GF let them contact me is because they wanted me to pay funeral expenses. Most fucked up few days of my life. Yep, I have bipolar I with psychotic features, and before my first real manic break I thought I was just depressed or maybe bipolar too. After experiencing psychosis and full-blown mania, I am not quite the same even during my more stable periods. I'm constantly anxiety-ridden and reclusive and am way less pleasant to be around. My personality has been blunted because I'm more afraid of people judging anything I do who knows of my history, and because I'm a lot more serious of a person than I used to be. I cycle a lot faster now and the illness constantly consumes me. Before, it was just something lying under the surface. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. To understand why this is the most depressing thing someone has told me, I must provide a little context. My grandmother, who grew up in a very poor, rural area and was considered poor, by poor people's standards, mainly because her father drank up pretty much every dime that came into the household. I found out later he also raped her, but that is another story. Anyway, one day she told me that she had to go to school, elementary, with only a cold piece of fatback pork and a small biscuit for lunch in an old sack. She said all of the other kids either brought actual legitimate lunches in a lunch pail or bought food. So she sat all alone every day eating her lunch because the other kids would treat her like garbage by making fun of her for her old raggedy clothes and her pitiful lunch. And she said that she wished so much she could have what the other kids were eating just every once in a while. My 25-year-old daughter, whom I've been trying to have a positive relationship with, constantly invents some way to be angry with me. Heart attack preempted me from working on her truck equals blocked on phone and social media for 6 months. Bought 4 new tires for her truck that didn't match her spare, blocked for 6 months. Grandfather gave me $5,000 to dole out for her college versus giving straight to her. She previously spent thousands on a dog and eating out every night, equals blocked for a year. She seemed to be trying to put all that behind her and things were fine for a year or so. I called her on Christmas Day at 7 p.m. but was blocked. I heard she was mad I waited so long in the day. She finally called me to yell at me and I said I thought you were past this kind of stuff. One time while I was at work, I got a call from my father. He was crying and sobbing at the other end of the line, so I was almost expecting him to tell me a family member had died or some such. Well, it turns out he didn't know either, other than his medication had been changed and he just started crying out of the blue and needed someone to talk with for a bit to compose himself. Asked him if he needed me to come home or something, but he said he'd be okay. Doesn't seem like much until you realize my father is of the old school of thought that a man can't show any emotion, and it was literally the second time I saw/heard him cry in my life. One time in college, for some reason I was talking with my friend about light pollution. I think I told her that I missed being able to see more than just a few stars, since my hometown was rural and you could see quite a few there. Then I asked her if she could see the stars from her hometown and she said I don't know. I said, what do you mean? And she explained that her family always just drove directly into the garage and went into the house from there. Not once in her entire life had she been outside her house at night and looked up to see the stars. There are certainly more depressing things I've heard, especially compared to other stories in this thread, but for some reason it stuck with me. It made me feel so deeply sad for her. I think about it every once in a while, over a decade later. Guy that works for me, super nice guy. Homeless because he used to do drugs but is clean now and just trying to get his life on track but can't. Any and all programs he's tried don't accept him. The only ones that do wanna send him to halfway house, which is worse than being on the street according to him. Every week or so seems either his backpack full of everything gets stolen or his bike/only mode of transportation gets stolen. So every check he can't save or anything because it's always back to square one. Yesterday he was venting to me and basically said it's getting harder and harder to find a reason to wake up. He just sees no reason to continue but does, and now I'm scared something could happen to him. I could write a novel of depressing shit. No, one thing is a clear number one. My mother telling me her experiences in the medical field had given her the hope that she would die in her early 60s, as being old didn't seem worth it. Guy I grew up with telling me he didn't brush his teeth because it's too much work. Guy I know telling me he knew he was being taken advantage of by his girlfriend but he loved her too much and he couldn't help himself. This one might top it. I was trying to explain the concept of depression to my father. I got the "what do you mean you're depressed, you have nothing to be depressed about." At a party with a mate who, over the course of the evening, took people that he knew aside, one by one, to tell them what he really thought of them. Afterwards I shared a taxi ride with him, as I lived along the route to his place. Hopped out of the taxi at my stop and he said, "I'll see you around." Thought the whole night was strange AF but went to sleep thinking he was just very drunk. Was telephoned 2 days later to be told he went back to his place and hung himself in the garage that night. Damn, just writing this has made me depressed. I couldn't make it to Thanksgiving to see my father. Every year we, my daughter and I, went to see him. I was at new job which wouldn't allow anyone the Friday after Thanksgiving off. He wasn't feeling well, told me it was a cold. I chatted, told him to feel better. Next day at work the reception person runs to find me and says I have an important call. It was the hospital telling me my father passed away. I tell my boss, at this point it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Response: are you going to finish your shift? Go home. Tell my daughter and girlfriend at the time. Call my mother, they were divorced for many years. Try talking to girlfriend about my father. Response: I don't have time for this, find a counselor or someone else to speak to. It's been 3 years. Not a day goes by that I don't miss my father. I have so much guilt for not putting my family before a job. I will never make that mistake again. That 10 people in the school I was currently in had been murdered by a student. I was across the school and very high on a vape pen when the fire alarm went off. Everybody on this side of the school thought there was just a fire. But when we got outside, the VPS were screaming at us to run. I thought the school was going to explode, but still kept walking since I was high as shit. They make us cross the highway, which was insane to me, and we all huddle, being an auto repair shop. There were 50 or so cops lined up the road and kids crying. I assumed someone got in a fight maybe. Then they march us down the road 1/2 mile or so to another school. My mom had been trying to text me, but I was so high I didn't realize and actually really enjoyed the walk on the road, hitting my pen in front of everyone. I only learned what happened when my parents showed up. Ruined our lives. My grandmother was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer on May 18, 2017. I went down to see her a lot that summer, and during one of my visits, I was blessed to have some time alone with her. I'll never forget sitting out on the back patio with her, taking in the hot summer air in Oklahoma, and having her tell me that while she wasn't scared to pass away and join my grandpa and all her siblings in heaven, she was scared to leave me, my mother, and the rest of our family. I'll never, ever forget those words. She passed away on February 3, 2018. She was my very best friend. I miss her every day. Visiting my grandpa in the hospital after he had a surgery. We had picked up my grandma to come. She had Alzheimer's. Very bad at this point. She didn't know me or my dad. She had to use the bathroom while we were there, but was unable to do so herself. My dad went in to try to help her. He came back out, looking a bit flustered, and found a nurse who could help her. The whole visit was just really depressing. My grandparents were old, in their mid-90s. When we left and were driving back home, my dad was quiet. Then he said, "I don't ever want to live to be that old." It wasn't what he said, but more so the way he did. He's 72 now. Still doing well. But that always makes me sad to remember. 3 years ago, when my husband picked me up from the train station, he was very quiet. When we arrived home there were plenty of cars in our neighbor's driveway, thought it was a party, but nope, they were police cars. When husband parked our car, he told me our sweet lady neighbor hanged herself that late afternoon. She has been battling depression for 20 years and she just cannot take it anymore. What's more depressing is that it's her youngest daughter, 15, who found her hanging in their living room. I remember exactly the date, 1 March 2018, gloomiest day I ever remembered. That's also the death anniversary of paternal grandpa. I'm coming into this pretty late, but maybe someone will see this. To this day, I don't know if what Jeff said is the most depressing or the goddamned funniest thing he ever said to me. Jeff was an all-around good dude. He was always in pretty good spirits, well except when I overheard him on a phone call with a car salesman. He apparently signed a contract that he thought was $300/month for 3 years, but it was for 7, was really nice, and told the best, worst, dad jokes. He could probably be the single, biggest contributor to r/dad jokes were he still around today. He was a good 20 years older than I was at the time. Had I been a bit older, I think we could have been friends instead of just co-workers.